Welcome back, everybody, to my continued trek through Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation, the novel series. I am now on Volume 2, Chapter 6, and this is where things get really interesting. I was super enthralled with how much insight we got into the world of labyrinths in the first volume, and I have to say, Volume 2 really steps it up a notch as we get a full insight into the entire history of the universe, which, if you're an anime-only fan, you'll probably find a lot of this stuff extremely interesting, as, unfortunately, none of it was really covered in the anime. Now, granted, it can be covered later, so I'll give my warning there, but I do want to give emphasis that we're getting into some really interesting stuff that was never covered in the anime. So with that said, let's jump into Chapter 6 of Volume 2. Rudius explains that over 100,000 years ago, the world was split up into 7 smaller worlds. Each one of these worlds had a god that was ruling over it, and this was known as the Ancient Age of the Gods. Each respected world and their god was the human world, obviously the human god, demons with the demon god, the dragon world with the dragon god, the ocean world with the sea god, the sky world with the sky god, and the barren world with the barren god. Each one of these worlds were separated by a barrier, so coming and going was no easy task. So you'd assume that any normal person within each one of these worlds would not even know the other ones existed. Only the gods were strong enough to go beyond the barriers. That'll change with 10 to 20,000 years ago. In the dragon world, an evil dragon god was born, with an incredible amount of power. He destroyed the barriers that were separating the world, and he and his followers, known as the 5 Dragon Commanders, began destroying the other worlds. Anybody that survived each of these worlds would flee into the other worlds. But once there was only one remaining world, the commanders of this dragon god turned on him. The head of the 5 Dragon Commanders, the Dragon Emperor, and the other 4 Dragon Kings fought with him with overwhelming power. In the end, it ended with a draw. The dragon world crumbled in the aftermath, and all that was remaining was one world, this world, the world that Rudius is in. Then we get into a period between 8 and 10,000 years ago. This is known as the Chaos Period. Being that you have all these races from different worlds all coming to one single world, there's obviously a lot of clashing that was happening. He says that there's not really much literature for this time period, but according to the scholars, after many years of just battles happening, the races slowly became segregated. The beast folk moved to the woods, the water folk to the oceans, the sky folks went to the highest mountains. There was nearly no dragonkin remaining, so they just kind of lived in secrecy, hidden away. Who the void folk, who can pretty much live anywhere, kind of spread themselves out. That left 2 races, the humans and the demons, who kind of just kept fighting amongst themselves upon the plains. And at that time, the central continent and the demon continent were kind of joined, and it was this one massive great continent. This jumps to about approximately 7,000 years ago when we had martial art and magic being developed. And with that, the population increasing. This is also the point in which they had the first great human-demon war. Jump forward about another 1,000 years, so 6,000 years ago. The hero Eris led his 6 comrades into battle, continuing hostilities until he defeated the 5 great demon kings and the great emperor Kishirika. At this point, he kind of knows the idea that based on that name, he kind of just envisions in his head Eris standing there cackling in some weird leather outfit. At this point, we jump to 5,500 years ago. The humans, being the fools they are, just drunk with their power, they start attacking the other races of the world. And not having many options, decides to fight amongst themselves, because as humans do. And this led to a continued war for 500 years, demons being enslaved and everything. Now, 5,000 years ago, the second great human-demon war has begun. Seeking vengeance, Kishirika decides to stir up the demons and start war again. This is where Rudius kind of notes that Kishirika is probably immortal. Either that or it's some sort of title given to anybody that holds the throne, but he kind of assumes it's because she's immortal. Even if they died, they would just kind of revive 100 years later. The demons made allies with the beast folk and the sea folk, and they eventually drove the humans into a corner. This jumps to 4,200 years ago. We have the second great human war coming to an end. The humans not allowing themselves to be defeated, fight for 800 years to eventually drive the enemy back. At this point, he notes the legendary hero Golden Knight Aldebaran. He claims that he's a cheater, routing 10,000 men by himself. And this is where we get an interesting change of the geographics of this world. As I mentioned earlier, you had the demon continent, the central continent were one. Well, at this point, he talks about the fact that this great hero caused such a powerful attack, it created this huge crater that was filled in with the sea, thus splitting it into 2 continents. One passage wrote that he was the human god himself, that only Aldebaran I knew was the one who would die if he used his own lethal technique. After this, with the separation between these 2 continents, we sort of have some peace. Jumping forward to about 1,000 years ago, as time passed, you had most all the demons being pushed away and segregated to the demon continent, obviously being barren versus the lushness that is the central continent. And despite this, some of them, it seemed like they kind of accepted them being segregated, as they kind of wanted to have this end to this war. Jumping forward, we have the demon god Laplace finally came into being. He knows that there's a long history of demon kings and demon emperors, but there's this one case of the reference of a demon god, and that is Laplace. Very quickly, Laplace built up a demon army and quickly conquered the entirety of the demon continent. So many records of his battles were passed down, and still to this day, Laplace is kind of seen as an idol. Over many years, putting together his empire, grooming his race to be tough and fierce. And that all jumps to 500 years ago when Laplace starts his military campaign. In the earlier segments of his invasion, he attacks from the south to draw the attention of the humans before sending troops to the north to pincer attack. Very quickly taking control of both the north and the south, scattering his enemy. This leads to 400 years ago when humankind's kind of back in the corner. They take a gamble. They decide these 7 warriors, these 7 heroes, decide to convince the sea folk to allow them to get past their blockade. This sets them out to sail to Millis continent. And Millis has been avoiding invasion because they have this barrier around it. The robust army of the Holy Knights and the topography that made it difficult for large enemies to disembark. And part of the reason why they were so isolated is because they had this northern forest, this great forest. Now, that's when it gets a little dirty. and Rudius kind of mentions this idea that he thinks that things were written a little bit differently. He has this whole concept that these 7 heroes basically went out and kidnapped the children of the heads of all these clans to have them cooperate with them. And it's kind of written as the children cooperated with them, not that they kidnapped them. But additionally, the last remaining kingdom of the humans in the central continent, the kingdom of Asura, mounted an all-out effort in their final battle. With them, the 7 heroes, along with the Holy Knights of Millis and all the beast folk, they assaulted the Laplace's main stronghold. Unfortunately for the humans, though, after this, 4 of the 7 heroes were dead, but they successfully sealed Laplace away and destroyed his closest companions. The 3 heroes that did survive was Dragon King Urupin, which we kind of mentioned earlier when we were talking about Pyragus, Northern God Kalman, and the Armored Dragon Knight Pyragus. They were referred to as the 3 legendary demon god slayers. And I like how Eris kind of explains, but he didn't even kill him. He didn't even slay him. He sailed him away. Following this, obviously the humans were exhausted, so many resources gone, they decided to create a treaty and peace amongst the nations. And we kind of mentioned before where, yes, technically beast folk should be allowed around the areas. There's still discriminations, obviously. And yes, the ban was lifted on the demon continent, allowing for travel. And with that said, that brings us to the present day. Like I said, crazy to get into that full history. I was really not expecting that. The moment I opened that page, I was like, whoa, okay, we're going back in time. We're going all the way back to the 7 worlds, all the races, how they came together. It is truly cool. I love to have that much insight and not an insane amount of thought put into its history, but a significant history. Like, this is obviously something that's going to be in textbooks. The everyday lives isn't going to be in textbook. The wars and how things came to be, the races and conflicts that we've seen in the past, it lays a lot of foundation for what's to come. Obviously, being an anime season 1 watcher, there's a couple characters in there that we technically talk about. So it's very interesting to kind of get this glimpse into the world and the history that was laid out. It gives it more of a breathing world, honestly. Moving on, it was kind of interesting that Rudius mentions by reading the history of the world itself in the universe, technically, he mentioned there's like some oddities about it. That 7 seems to be the lucky number. There's 7 legendary heroes, 7 worlds. But he also mentions that he believes that 6 is an unlucky number, as you have these 2 villain groups, the Dragon Gods group and you have the Demon Gods group. They all had about a number of 6. 5 generals and 1 leader. He also notes that he believes that elves and halflings are sort of subspecies, as they're not mentioned in any of that knowledge of the past races. He believes that they're counted amongst the demons, Baron folks, or they possibly were just developed during the chaotic period. And the final thing that he notes about the history of what he studied is that he believes that there's so many records based on the idea that he believes there's so many that are existing that are actually immortal, pointing out one example being the demon emperor Kishirika. After this point, he does note a couple things about what he learned about languages specifically. That human tongues was generally used in the central continent, beast tongue being only really used in the North Millis continent. As we mentioned before, that's the area that has a great forest there, where all the beast folk are at. Then there's the fighting god tongue that's mainly used in the Begarit continent. I'm butchering that, I know it. There's a sky god tongue that's used on the divine continent, the demon god tongue that's used in the demon continent, and then there's the sea god tongue, which is mainly used in the seas. He knows that they kind of distinguish each of these languages using the gods of various races, but he kind of knows that he believes that the human tongue isn't really stated that because they're afraid of angering the human god, thus only calling it human tongue. After this, he gets into a little bit about how he's been making money. He's been selling figures. He's obviously doing this tutoring job. He's also helping Philip managing and hiring their daily part-time workers. And additionally, buying and reselling wares at different periods of time. This is where we get the letter from Roxy. Now, I kind of found it odd that this is actually something that shows up at a different time in the anime. But in this letter, she talks about how she's excited that she's got this job to tutor this Liege Lore's daughter. She claims that she got the interview for the job but failed. It also notes that she believes that Ghislaine is very famous, claiming that she's the fourth strongest warrior in the sword god style. But additionally, she talks about how she's very proud of him and that he's doing an incredible job. She's very surprised by what he's done and accomplished. She says it's interesting that this boy that once was a 5-year-old that peeked into her when she was bathing is now doing all this stuff, and he kind of makes all this goofy comments about how it wasn't that he was peeking, it just happened. It's not that he deliberately did it and then he was peeking. He just walked around the corner and it happened. He knew that she was doing it, but he wasn't peeking. But this was really cool. One of the cool things I noticed with the explanation of the book that Roxy made for Rudius. For those that don't remember, he essentially wrote this letter asking about how he wants to learn Demon Tongue, and so she writes this book that helps him learn it. And unfortunately, in the anime, that's all it is. The book is just to teach him Demon Tongue. She did all this cool stuff, drew these illustrations to help him learn it. And she even went through the efforts of, binding it and making a cover and everything. It was a very beautiful gift that she gave him that had a lot of effort put behind it. Additionally, noting the idea that she'd be very sad if she sees it in a shop someday to take care of it, basically. But there's more to it than that. There's more to this book in the novel than the anime led you to believe. It's a dictionary. It's a translation of every word to Demon Tongue. He notes the idea that she probably found a full-on dictionary of all the words somewhere in this palace that she's working at and translated every single one of them for him. It covered vocabulary, specific turn of phrases, even described the pronunciation extensively. But here's the interesting thing. The later half of the book is something else. She wrote about everything she knew about various demon races. Descriptions, commentary, do's and don'ts. All, as he notes, done with poorly drawn traits. And of course, he notes the idea there's a extensive segment of it just for the people of Midgard race. Obviously, it's the one that she would know most about because she was raised there, but he kind of notes that he believes that he's putting so much effort into the Midgard race so that he would know more about the race that she's from. And he also notes that Midgard loves sweets. So he kind of makes it a promise to himself that one day he's going to make sure that he gives her something sweet. It was just really cool. I'm a huge Roxy fan. Of all the characters, Roxy is my favorite. Right now, I think she's my favorite character of all time. She has even taken over the status from Rem. I absolutely adore Roxy. And to get this kind of insight into something that she especially made for Rudy. You do get a sense that she really does care for Rudy. And this is something that we'll get into later on at the end of the volume 2, which I've already gotten to, where it does have a perspective from Roxy. And additionally, when she goes to the billboards and really does seek to want to help his family. It really does give you a sense that Roxy does truly care for Rudius. This is somebody that really did change his life, and she really did treasure the time that she spent with his family. Now, finally, after this entire volume, and I was believing that we weren't going to get a single moment of somebody else's perspective, we finally get Ghislaine's perspective. This is kind of giving us a sense of what she felt like having to take care of Rudius. She believed that he was so young and that Paul was just overconfident about his sweet little child, and that she kind of feels like he pushed Rudius upon her. And while she knows that she doesn't really necessarily have feelings for Paul, she does have a sense of obligation towards him, and so she did accept this whole thing. But the thing that really changed her perspective in Rudius was seeing how he handled the kidnappers, taking on an advanced tier North God style. It's kind of interesting because at this point she's talking about how Rudius himself has sort of changed her. Because the things that he's taught her over this period of time, she almost has a sense that she wants to go back to her home village and show them where she's at now. Show them what she's learned in arithmetic and everything that she feels like she can show off to them. And it's sort of a triumphant feeling now that she never thought she would ever have. All because of this boy. This young boy. This all leads to her wanting to call Rudius her master. Something that she feels like if her old master knew about this, he'd be angry. Don't compare me to this boy. Which that does lead us into learning about Ghislaine's master, which is something that I honestly have been extremely excited about learning about, because we've only really got brief glimpses of the moment that she first left her village. That yes, before she even reached the age of 10, she was an outcast of her village. She was just wild. Until one day, this wandering swordsman came and they gave her off to them. And who is this swordsman? This is a divine tier swordsman. He was always preaching logic to her, focusing on foundations and really kind of stamping it into her head, which she kind of equates a little bit to Rudius, that despite the fact that Eris is always complaining, he's always kind of pushing the foundations into her head. Again, kind of draws that parallels that she probably thinks her master would be angry about. But she's noting this is a good thing. Like, knowing the foundations is a good thing. It's not important to, like Eris wants, to have something that's sparkly and poofy. It's all about having the fundamentals and being very good at it and adapting. And that's something that she really does see in Rudeus. She knew based on her experience that a good fighter isn't somebody that's going to cast some really long fantastical spell and get themselves killed. It's somebody that adapts and moves and uses abilities quickly. She honestly believed that magicians themselves were useless until she met Rudeus, which is quite a statement. I mean, take note of this point. There was a magician in Paul's party. So that means that Ghislaine believed that they were useless. It's really cool at this point. She does note that there was an ability that she wanted to teach Rudy that would allow him to defeat Paul. But she believes that it requires, it's one of those things that he overthinks it too much, so it'd never work. Like, Rudeus could never use this technique because he overthinks things. He overthinks it to a point where it's illogical, which is something that makes sense with magic. It's just something that she believes doesn't really make sense with swordplay. And that's where she believes that it'll never work for Rudeus. It almost feels like at this point she's kind of giving up on the idea of him ever being this great swordsman. But even still, she knows that his thinking process is more suited for something like the North God style or the Water God style, which is something that Paul never really taught him. But she does note that she has somebody that can teach him North God style, and that she would introduce Rudeus to this person in about 3 years if he still wanted to. For now, she wants to just focus on giving him those fundamentals, which at this point, I'm just assuming is her master. This is a difficult part because I love both Ghislaine and, of course, I adore Roxy. And it almost feels like this inner dialogue right here was really the point which Ghislaine was really poking at Roxy. Ghislaine really believed that Roxy was pathetic, that this person just ran away from Rudeus. But she's coming to a realization right now that she kind of feels the same way as Roxy, but at the same time believes that she wants to thank Roxy someday because essentially she's learning magic through proxy of Rudeus. After this, we have a little funny comment about how she's teaching Rudeus Beast Tongue, and he believes that the only reason he wants to know that is so that he can basically get cat girls and stuff for his little harem. And he knows the idea that he feels like the gray rats are just weird. Like, overall, the gray rats, for some reason, like, everybody else sees her tail and ears and they're kind of discriminatory against them. But he knows the idea that most people, when they're attracted to her, they're looking at her chest. They're looking at, not her tail and her ears. The gray rat family always look at their tail and their ears. She finds them weird. Additionally, it does seem like she notes that Eris has a thing for Rudeus. She sees the same sparkle that she has in her eyes that Zenith once had. But I don't think but of course, again, he's wanting to learn all these languages, so she feels like he's just going around getting a harem. But she does note the idea that Eris has changed a lot. From the moment that she first met her, she's changed so much. This is somebody that when she first met her, she basically strong-armed her down. And then after that, every night she had to wake up to Eris trying to get a sneak attack in on her. But now Eris is more refined. She's dressing herself. She's keeping herself from getting dirty like she used to do. She used to, again, go to the barn and lay on the hay. I mean, this is a girl now that's keeping herself proper and clean, obvious because she wants to impress Rudeus. But on that note, she does talk about how she believes that Eris will one day be a strong warrior. She can't outdo Rudeus in really anything else, but swords she can. She has a fighting spirit that really drives her movement. And if she can learn to consciously use that, she will easily reach advanced. And if one day she reaches Saint tier, she will introduce her to her master. But that's all I'm going to cover. My gosh. Like, the entirety of Chapter 6 was all new stuff, so I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you guys enjoyed this run-through of Chapter 6 of Volume 2. I hope you guys have been enjoying this series. It seems like a lot of the feedback has been super positive, and I definitely appreciate your guys' support. Definitely appreciate you guys sharing out these videos and letting people know about it, commenting and liking, all that kind of stuff. Hopefully going forward we can start running through things a little bit quicker, but like I said, most of Chapter 6 was all new stuff and it was super fascinating. So as always, I want to thank you all for watching. If you want to support us more, we have a Patreon link and a tips link in the description below. We also have a super thanks button where you can support us directly. I thank you all for watching, and y'all take care.